Evelyn stepped out of the cab, the cold coastal air biting at her cheeks as she tightened her coat around her. The small Victorian house stood before her, shrouded in a familiar fog that seemed heavier than she remembered. Its silhouette loomed in the dim light of the setting sun, every creak of its aged wood carried by the wind, whispering secrets of its own. Green leaves whispered and silk, small and red and whimpering. She hadn't been home in 10 years, not since she left this isolated town with a suitcase full of ambition and a heart weighed down by memories. But here she was, drawn back by the pull of family and a sense of obligation she could never quite escape. Her father's voice over the phone had been brittle, his words laced with concern for Ethan. "Your brother's been different lately," he'd said, before trailing off into a vague discomfort that left Evelyn uneasy. The house was eerily unchanged. The once vibrant yellow paint was now faded, peeling in long strips like the skin of a forgotten fruit. A single porch light flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance and taunt. The moment she stepped through the threshold, she felt it. The weight of time pressing down on her. Inside, the air smelled of aged wood, faint mildew, and something she couldn't quite place. Something sharp, almost metallic. Her father greeted her with a tired smile, his frame thinner than she remembered. Ethan, however, was nowhere to be seen. "He's out," her father said gruffly, avoiding her questioning gaze. "You'll see him soon enough." Evelyn's old room greeted her with a wave of nostalgia and disquiet. The furniture sat exactly as she had left it, like a museum exhibit curated just for her absence. The bed was made with the same floral quilt, the edges worn, and on the desk, her old sketchpad lay undisturbed. She ran her fingers over its cover, her mind drifting back to nights spent sketching by the light of a flickering desk lamp. Using art to escape the tensions that brewed just beyond her bedroom door, that night as she unpacked, she noticed something peculiar. Her belongings, untouched for years, were no longer exactly where she remembered leaving them. A drawer slightly ajar, a chair shifted just so. It wasn't obvious, but it was enough to unsettle her. Sleep didn't come easily. The house groaned and sighed in the quiet hours, each sound amplified in the stillness. Around midnight, Evelyn felt an inexplicable pull to the attic, a place she had avoided as a child, its dark corners and locked doors, fueling her imagination. The stairs creaked under her careful steps, and when she reached the attic, the smell hit her first, an acrid, stale odor that made her stomach churn. She hesitated at the trunk in the corner, an old relic of her mother's, now covered in a fine layer of dust. Inside, she found them, photographs dark and haunting, their content sending a chill through her entire being. A whisper behind her made her spin around. Ethan stood there, his blue eyes glinting in the dim light. "If you tell," he said, his voice calm and measured, "I'll make sure everyone knows you started it." Evelyn stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan's figure was a shadow against the faint light seeping through the attic window, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the chaos unraveling inside her. His words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "I'll make sure everyone knows you started it." "What are you talking about, Ethan?" Evelyn finally managed, her voice steadier than she felt. He smirked, an unnerving curl of his lips that sent a shiver down her spine. "You always had such a vivid imagination, Evie. Don't let it get the better of you now." Without another word, he turned and descended the stairs, his footsteps deliberate and measured. Evelyn's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to look back at the photographs in the trunk. They were old, worn at the edges, but their contents were unmistakable. They depicted people, some familiar, some not, in vulnerable, unsettling positions. The faces seemed strained, their expressions a mix of confusion and dread. A pit formed in her stomach as she sifted through them. There was something disturbingly personal about these images, though she couldn't yet articulate why. She closed the trunk with trembling hands and sat down on the dusty floor, her mind racing. Hmm. Ethan had always been a bit of a mystery. As kids, she had chalked it up to their age difference and his tendency to keep to himself. But this was something else entirely. The next morning, Evelyn's father was unusually quiet over breakfast, his hands shaking as he held his coffee mug. Ethan didn't come home last night, he said flatly. Evelyn didn't press him. She knew he wouldn't have answers, not the kind she needed. After the discovery in the attic, she couldn't look at her father the same way. Did he know what was hidden up there? Or worse, had he chosen to ignore it? Determined to understand the truth, Evelyn decided to dig deeper. While her father napped in his recliner that afternoon, she began searching the house for more clues. In Ethan's room, she found nothing at first. A neatly made bed, a desk covered in empty notebooks, and a wardrobe full of meticulously folded clothes. It was only when she pulled out the bottom drawer that she discovered the false bottom beneath it. Inside, she found a journal. Its pages were filled with Ethan's handwriting, sharp and angular, the ink pressed hard into the paper. At first glance, the entries seemed cryptic, full of disjointed thoughts and symbols. But as she flipped through, a pattern emerged. He wrote about their mother's death, about the loneliness that followed, and then about control. How much he craved it, how much he despised feeling powerless. One entry stopped her cold. I found her in the woods that day. She looked at me like I was the monster. I told her I'd keep her secret. Now it's mine, and she'll never take it back. The page was smudged, as though he had gripped the pen too tightly while writing. Evelyn's mind reeled. Who was he talking about? What secret? The sound of the front door slamming broke her concentration. Ethan's voice echoed up the stairs. Evie, I know you're snooping. She shoved the journal into her bag and stood, her pulse racing. There was no turning back now. Evelyn barely had time to steady her breathing before Ethan's footsteps began ascending the stairs. She shoved the journal deeper into her bag and stepped away from his desk, her pulse pounding in her ears. Evie! His voice was casual, but there was a sharpness beneath the surface that made her skin crawl. He appeared in the doorway moments later, his figure filling the frame. His calm exterior contrasted with the storm she felt brewing inside her. What are you doing in my room? He asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. But his eyes were anything but relaxed. Looking for some aspirin? She lied, holding up an empty bottle she'd grabbed hastily from his dresser. Dad's been complaining about headaches. Ethan's lips twitched into a thin smile. Sure. Aspirin? His gaze lingered on her longer than necessary, making her want to bolt from the room. But she held her ground, refusing to let him see her unease. Dinner's at 6, he finally said, stepping aside to let her pass. Don't be late. Evelyn hurried past him, her thoughts racing. She needed space to think, to process what she'd read in the journal. The entry about her in the woods, paired with the photographs in the attic, painted a picture she wasn't ready to confront. Outside, the fog hung low over the cliffs, shrouding the town in a gray haze. Evelyn made her way to the diner at the edge of town, the one that had barely changed since she was a teenager. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the warmth of the small space was a welcome contrast to the cold knot in her stomach. Evie! A familiar voice called from behind the counter. It was Noah, a childhood friend, who had grown into the local detective. His dark eyes brightened with recognition, though they quickly clouded when he saw the tension in her face. What brings you back? He asked, pouring her a cup of coffee without waiting for her order. Evelyn hesitated, unsure how much to share, but the words spilled out before she could stop them. She told him about the attic, the photographs, and the journal, her voice trembling with the weight of her discovery. Noah listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each detail. When she finished, he leaned forward, his voice low. Ethan's always been different, he said carefully. But this This is something else. Evelyn felt a flicker of relief. For the first time, she wasn't alone in this. What do I do, Noah? He set his jaw, his demeanor shifting into something more resolute. You let me help. We'll figure this out together. For the first time in days, Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The following morning, Evelyn woke to the faint hum of conversation downstairs. She listened carefully, her heart sinking when she recognized Ethan's voice mingling with their father's. It wasn't unusual for Ethan to manipulate their father with his charm and persuasive words, but today it sounded different. Calculated. She stayed upstairs, peering through the banister as their father shuffled into the kitchen, his steps slower than they had been years ago. Ethan's tone was calm, almost soothing. Dad, you know Evie has always had a way of exaggerating things, Ethan said, his words dripping with feigned concern. She's been through a lot. Maybe coming back here was a mistake? Their father murmured something too low to hear, but Evelyn caught enough to understand his hesitation. Ethan was planting seeds of doubt, just as he had so many times before. Evelyn retreated to her room, a mix of anger and dread clawing at her insides. She couldn't sit idly by while Ethan worked to undermine her. She needed to take control of the situation. In fact, later that afternoon, Evelyn met with Noah in a secluded spot near the cliffs. The wind whipped around them, carrying the salty scent of the ocean as they reviewed the journal together. Noah's brow furrowed deeper with each page, his trained eye catching details Evelyn had missed. Repeated symbols, strange references to times and places, and unsettling phrases that hinted at events long buried. He tapped Noah this once. This part here, Noah said, pointing to an entry about their mother's death. He mentions being there when it happened. But the way he writes about it, it's almost like he's implicating himself. Evelyn's breath caught. She had always assumed their mother's passing was a tragic accident, an unexpected fall down the stairs on a stormy night, but now the narrative felt less certain, like a puzzle with missing pieces. Do you think Evelyn trailed off, unable to finish the thought. I don't know, Noah admitted, his tone grave. But I think we need more than just this journal. We need something concrete. Evelyn nodded, determination hardening in her chest. Together, they devised a plan to gather evidence without tipping Ethan off. Noah would quietly look into the town's records, searching for anything suspicious tied to Ethan or their family's past. Meanwhile, Evelyn would stay close to home, keeping an eye on her brother while trying to uncover more clues. Back at the house, Evelyn felt the weight of the journal in her bag as she walked through the door. Ethan was in the living room, reclining on the worn-out sofa with a book in hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Nice walk," he asked, his voice light but probing. "It was fine," she replied, keeping her tone even. As she moved past him, Evelyn could feel his gaze lingering, as though he knew she was hiding something. Her grip tightened on the strap of her bag. In that moment, Evelyn realized the full gravity of what she was up against. Ethan wasn't just dangerous, he was watching her every move. The storm rolled in fast that evening, clouds thick and heavy, casting an eerie darkness over the coastal town. Evelyn watched from the attic window as lightning flickered over the ocean, illuminating the jagged cliffs in flashes of silver. The journal lay open on the desk in front of her, its pages revealing more than she ever wanted to know. She had spent hours poring over Ethan's cryptic notes, piecing together a disturbing pattern. The photographs, the journal entries, even the whispers about their mother's death. They all pointed to one undeniable truth. Ethan was more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. A knock on her door made her jump. "Dinner!" Ethan called through the wood. His voice was steady, but she could hear the tension beneath it. "I'll be down soon," she replied, forcing her voice to sound neutral. She waited until his footsteps retreated before slipping the journal into her bag. Tonight, she needed answers, and she knew Ethan wouldn't give them willingly. At dinner, the air was suffocating. Their father sat at the head of the table, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension between his children. Ethan smiled and made small talk, the perfect image of charm. But Evelyn noticed the way his fingers tapped against the table, a steady, rhythmic motion that betrayed his nerves. After their father retired for the night, Evelyn followed Ethan to the living room. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows. Ethan poured himself a drink and settled into the armchair, his casual demeanor failing to mask the predator lurking beneath. "We need to talk," Evelyn said, standing just inside the doorway. Ethan swirled his drink, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Oh? About what, Evie?" She stepped closer, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I know what you've been hiding, the journal, the photographs, everything." His smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You don't know anything." "Don't I?" She shot back, her voice rising. "You think you can keep manipulating everyone, but it's over, Ethan. I've spoken to Noah. He's already looking into—" Ethan stood abruptly, the drink in his hand shattering against the floor. "You don't understand what you're doing," he hissed, his calm facade finally cracking. "I understand enough," Evelyn said, refusing to back down. The storm outside mirrored the chaos inside the house, and Evelyn knew the moment of reckoning was upon them.